Welcome everyone to an awesome Ask the Experts panel here at Build. Today we're going to have a special session on building cloud-native apps of any scale with Azure Cosmos DB, and this is going to be hosted by the wonderful Azure Cosmos DB team. First, we're going to go through some housekeeping here. So let's talk about how to engage with our experts. You're going to use the chat panel right there on the right to ask us questions. The questions will appear to all attendees once they get approved by our moderator. Our experts will answer the questions both over the session as well as over the IM window. And of course, our experts will also provide a bunch of resources once the session is over. Now, this is a live session. It is also being recorded, so please be on your behavior. Help our moderators out. Don't spam. Don't do silly things like say inappropriate things. Adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. I'm going to flash it here briefly. It's also going to be available in the IM window as a published Q&A. So here's how the session is going to run. We're going to go through a bunch of different updates with Azure Cosmos DB. I'm going to go and cycle through our panel of experts. This is the Azure Cosmos DB PM team. They're each going to talk to you about some wonderful new announcements. We'll take in questions that are related to those announcements first. And then, of course, this is a Ask Us Anything panel as well. So if you have questions that aren't related to any of these specific announcements, please also do ask them, and we will have a ample amount of time at the end to go through that. So I'll introduce the panel. My name is Andrew Liu. I am the session moderator here. We will have Deborah, Stephanie, Tim, Thomas, and Mustafa also joining us on a wonderful set of announcements. So let's get started. Deborah, how are you doing? Want to talk to us about free tier?
Good. Thanks, Andrew. Hey, everyone. I'm Deborah. Thanks all for joining. So we're really excited today to announce that we are expanding the Azure Cosmos DB free tier. Based on your feedback, we are now raising the free tier free quantities to 1,000 RUs and 25 GB of storage per month. So this is an increase from the previous values of 400 RUs and 5 GB. With free tier, you can get this for 1 account per subscription, and this will apply to the entire lifetime of the account. So with free tier, it's a really great way to get started with Cosmos DB, as well as even run some small workloads in production that might have steady traffic. To get started, all you have to do is in the Azure portal, when you create a new Cosmos DB account, just simply select Apply for Enable free tier discount. And once the account is created, we have a bunch of built-in portal getting started material for you to use. So from your Data Explorer, you can go to the gallery here, it's right there under Notebooks, and we have all these samples to introduce you to things you can do with Cosmos DB, and every single one of these samples will run with 1,000 RUs or less. So it's a great way to get started, and looking forward to seeing what you do with free tier.
Awesome, Deborah. Hey, what if I'm already using free tier? Do I have to take any action to get these increased quantities?
Great question. So for if you already have an account that's using free tier today, these new quantities of 1,000 RUs and 25 GB for free are automatically applied. So there's no action required.
Awesome. And what are some cool apps that I can do with the free tier? Like, what are people building?
Yeah, I've had a lot of really great apps submit that the community has let us know that they've used on free tier. So some examples that come to mind are there's an app that does scheduling for reservations at a clinic in Tokyo. There's another one that helps you share a group of URLs at a conference. The great thing about free tier is with 1,000 RUs, it's very flexible. With 1,000 RUs, you can do like 1,000 reads per second or 200 writes per second. So it's a really flexible amount of quantity to let you really build any app that you want to build.
That's awesome. Well, now that I can build into the cloud for free, I also am interested in how to do that locally on my local dev machine. Stephanie, would you like to tell us about how to do that?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie, a PM on Cosmos DB, and I'm so excited to say that we're finally announcing the preview of our one of our most highly requested features, the Linux emulator. Fun fact, it's actually one of our top 2 user voice items with more than 2,000 upvotes. And as most of you might know, we currently have support for Cosmos DB emulator on Windows MSI version. Many of you have requested a similar feature for Linux and Mac OS environments. And so with this new emulator, you have the ability to test locally without having to create a Cosmos DB account, without having to create anything on Azure, and best of all, without incurring any costs. Next slide. And once you have the emulator up and running, you are able to take the connection string, add it to your application, make requests to your locally installed version of Cosmos DB. And another cool feature about the emulator is that you can access the emulator via GUI, which emulates the data explorer that Deborah just showed in the Azure portal. And there you can also play around with Cosmos DB, create a database, insert a query, and get started with Cosmos DB, all for absolutely free. Another great feature that we have is cost-optimized diagnostics, which is now in preview. And for some background, with Cosmos DB, you have the option of enabling diagnostics for your account. This will allow you to monitor your resource in a more granular level. When you enable this, you can select multiple data sources, one of them being log analytics. And with this new feature, you're actually able to create diagnostic settings for resource-specific or Cosmos DB-specific tables. This allows for a few improvements, including better UX for querying your data, possible improvements in data ingestion and query times, and also last but not least, some additional cost optimizations with enabling diagnostics. So for customers who have already enabled diagnostics, this view on the bottom left of the slide is how you typically query Azure Diagnostics, and you specify which category you like to query, for example, control plane or data plane requests, and it's essentially one giant table. So when you enable resource-specific tables or Cosmos DB-specific tables, you will see 5 separate tables per API, and because of this, you will see CDB query runtime statistics, CDB data plane, and it makes it much more easier for you to work with log queries, and you're able to quickly view the schema of your tables, and you will see some potential cost savings when you have this settings enabled as compared to the previous Azure Diagnostics view. Back to you, Andrew.
Hey, Stephanie, we have a few questions here. One is, will I be able to see my old data if I'm already using the Azure Diagnostics in these new resource-specific tables?
So we actually don't import newer data or migrate any of your older data from Azure Diagnostics into resource-specific tables, but you are able to join the 2 tables if you have the settings enabled, and you can see your older data there.
Awesome. And how about, what if I had existing queries? Will my old queries continue to work with the new tables?
Short answer is no, but longer answer is you will have to make some tweaks to your queries. So as you see there, instead of using category query runtime statistics, we have new tables called CDB query runtime statistics. We've also made some changes to your columns where some of the column names had _S. We no longer have those. We kind of clean up the column names and made it much more readable. So you'll just have to tweak your queries to fit this category, but other than that, it will work.
Got it. Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. Now that we're able to both develop for free using the new increased free tier, as well as develop locally using the emulator, and debug my application with the diagnostics, I'd love to understand, how do I optimize my production workload? Tim, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So integrated cache is aimed at just that, taking an existing Cosmos DB workload and optimizing costs. So with the integrated cache, obviously it's an in-memory cache in Cosmos DB. You can get lower cost for reads without making any major code changes to your application. Because the integrated cache is built into Cosmos DB, it uses the same SDK and connection string as the rest of your Cosmos DB data. So in order to utilize the feature, you don't have to write any custom code or new business logic for populating the cache and validating the cache, or even reading the cache. And obviously, because it's Cosmos DB, it has built-in support and turnkey support for multi-regions. Now, on the next slide, we'll take a deep dive into how the integrated cache works. Now, the integrated cache is built in to something called a dedicated gateway. And a dedicated gateway is a new concept in Cosmos DB. Now, in the past, your app would connect maybe directly to Cosmos DB or connect to, our standard gateway. With the dedicated gateway, if you wanted to use the integrated cache, what you'll do is create a dedicated gateway that has the integrated cache built in, and now your app will connect to the dedicated gateway that will both route your requests to your backend partitions, as well as have the cache. The idea is if you ran the same query or point read again and again, it would go to the dedicated gateway, hit the cache, and be returned without utilizing any of your request units.
Wow, that's awesome, Tim. There's a few questions here. One is, how does the integrated cache billing work?
So the integrated cache is actually free. The billing is based on the dedicated gateway instance that you provision. So that dedicated gateway that you see in the middle of the screen, it basically handles routing requests, and it also has a significant amount of memory available for caching. So that's billed hourly, just like your RUs. So you can basically pick from a selection of different sizes for your dedicated gateway based on the amount of memory that you'll need for caching.
Got it. And now that I have the cache set up, how does that work for queries? I understand point reads, but does this have a query engine?
That's a really great thought and a good thing to bring up. So basically, if you run a query through the cache and then you run the same query again, that repeated query will hit the cache and won't utilize any of your RUs. So effectively what we're doing is we're taking all your queries and transforming them into a key value lookup automatically, where the key is the query text, and then the values, the query results. What's really cool about this is you don't need to make any code changes or any changes at all into how you run your queries in order to utilize the cache. All the same best practices and the same code that you would have used for queries in the past will work whether your query goes to the cache or is executed on our backend query engine.
Now that we have the integrated cache, another question that commonly gets asked is, how should I think about Azure Redis? Do I no longer need to use Azure Redis cache?
It's a really great thought, and they both have, great places in any kind of architecture on Azure. The integrated cache has a really narrow focus. The great thing about Azure Cache for Redis is you can use it with pretty much any database out there. The integrated cache is optimized specifically for use with Cosmos DB. So if you were using, let's say, another database on Azure, like Azure SQL, you would obviously want to use Azure Cache for Redis because it can be used with any database. The integrated cache is optimized specifically for existing Cosmos DB workloads. So if you have an existing Cosmos DB application that you maybe wrote before, that works. The idea with the integrated cache is you can leverage the benefits of caching with minimal code changes.
Awesome. And how does the integrated cache do cache invalidation? Are there different options available for tuning this?
Yeah, so the integrated cache is an LRU, least recently used cache with TTL. So the way that you'll manage data in the cache is by configuring a custom TTL setting, and that can be configured at the per request level. So if you had particular queries where you wanted to configure a basically maximum cache staleness for those queries, you could go and configure that on a per query basis. So if you, let's say, set that to 5 minutes, you'd get a guarantee that the query results, when they hit the cache, will never be more than 5 minutes stale. And then, of course, if it were more than 5 minutes stale, we'll go and refresh the data that's in the cache.
Awesome. Well, this is wonderful. Now that I have a cache for my high throughput workloads, I also want to explore Cosmos DB with some of my more intermittent workloads. Thomas, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening with Serverless?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andrew. And hi, everyone. This is Thomas from the Cosmos DB team. So you may remember that, well, pretty much 1 year ago at the Build conference of 2020, we announced the preview of Serverless on Cosmos DB, which is the alternative to a provision throughput on Cosmos DB. So Serverless is our consumption-based model where you only get charged for the request units that were actually consumed by your database operation, and of course by the storage that is consumed by your data. So basically, when you use Serverless on Cosmos DB, you don't have to provision any kind of throughput. You just create your resources and you get going. And the result of that is that Cosmos DB's entry price lowers even further. Now you may wonder, when is Serverless a good fit? Well, obviously, and first of all, when you get started with Cosmos DB, probably that over the first days, over the first weeks, you are going to explore our SDKs, you are going to maybe play around with our quick starts. and you will most probably only issue a handful of requests at the very beginning. So this is obviously a situation where serverless yields a great cost effectiveness. But even beyond that, in any situation, for any workload where your database is going to sit idle most of the time, serverless most likely will yield great benefits. So if you are getting started on a new project, you are just doing some development, testing, prototyping, or even if you are running an actual production application that is very bursty, right? It has a traffic that's very bursty and it has very long idle time between those bursts. Then that's another situation where most likely serverless will be of great value. I also wanted to note that serverless on Cosmos DB plays extremely well with Azure Functions, obviously. And if your goal is to build a solution that is completely serverless, consumption-based, end-to-end, then those two services pair very well. So yeah, serverless is now generally available. If you were waiting for serverless to come out of preview, the time is now, and you are more than welcome to get started with serverless on Cosmos DB today.
Hey, Thomas. Sometimes when we look at serverless technologies, in the past, we have seen serverless technologies run into the dreaded cold start problem. Does Cosmos DB also get impacted by this?
Not real cold starts as you may face them on Azure Functions, for example. On Azure Functions, when you are running on their consumption plan, and if you haven't been using your instance for quite some time, then you may have cold starts that can last 4 to 5 seconds. You don't have the same kind of behavior on Cosmos DB. You don't have those kind of long periods of time for the database to wake up. But you should keep in mind that one of the core differences between serverless and provision throughput on Cosmos DB is that provision throughput comes with latency SLAs, right? So we have a very strong guarantees over the very low latency that you get from Cosmos DB, and those guarantees are backed by financially backed SLAs. That's not the kind of guarantees you get with serverless. There is no SLA around latency. We have published SLOs, so those are our objectives in terms of latency, and we have engineered the service around those objectives, but there is no, let's say, contractual guarantee around the latency.
Awesome. And how is the feature support for serverless? I see a question here. Can we enable the analytical store for serverless accounts?
Yeah, this was one of the limitations we had throughout the preview. As of today, although serverless is going generally available today, that limitation is still in place, but we are in the process of removing that limitation. So over the coming weeks, you will be able to use the analytical store in conjunction with serverless.
Oh, awesome. Well, in that case, what kind of changes and updates are planned for serverless?
Yeah, I love this question. And I want to take that opportunity to thank all our users for the massive feedback we got throughout the serverless preview. We literally got hundreds and hundreds of feedback items, and so thanks for that. We have listened throughout the journey, and I want to make it clear that although we are going GA with serverless today, that offering will still evolve, right? And all those feedback items, we are still gathering them, we are still working on them, and we are working on some improvements that we are going to deliver over the second part of the year. We are looking in particular at all those little limitations that come with serverless today. You have limitations, around what you can do in general and on how much data you can store in a serverless container, for example. Those are all limitations that we plan to increase or remove altogether, thanks to the massive feedback we got.
Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. So now that I've built both my high throughput apps using the integrated cache, as well as my low throughput or intermittent bursty applications with serverless, how would I secure my application? I heard there's some new updates with RBAC.
Absolutely, yeah. And this is another big update for us from a security perspective. That new role-based access control with Azure Active Directory that has been in preview since the beginning of the year is also going generally available as of today. And really, this is a big update. I like to think about that feature it's pretty much the most important security update we ever had on Cosmos DB. It is essentially the next generation of access control on Cosmos DB. Now, most of you probably use what we call the primary key today to connect to your Cosmos DB account and to authenticate your database operations. Our role-based access control gives you an alternative to that. So if you don't want to use the master key now, you can use an Azure AD identity instead. And so if your goal is to get completely rid of primary keys, and if you really want to use Azure Active Directory as the end-to-end vehicle of authentication and authorizations throughout your solution, this is something that's possible today. What's very nice on top of that is that this feature has introduced a very fine-grained permission model that lets you create and assemble roles based on permissions that are very granular. And that lets you do things that were just impossible before. For example, if your requirement is to make sure that your client application is only allowed, let's say, to do document lookups by ID, but is not allowed to either run a query or read from the change feed. That was something that was not only challenging, but impossible to do with the primary keys before. This is something that you can do today with that very fine-grained permission model. And on top of that, the cherry on the cake is that if your requirement is also to do some very detailed auditing of your database operations, well, as soon as you start using Azure AD identities to authenticate your requests, those identities end up being logged in the data plane requests that end up in the diagnostic logs. So if you want to answer those questions, who did what and when, what were the identities used to query my data or to delete my data, this is something that you can do today with our new RBAC. So this is getting GA today, and it will be completely supported. It is completely supported for your production workloads.
Awesome, Thomas. I have a few questions on RBAC. One is, how do I assign roles to an Azure AD group?
Oh, to an Azure AD group. So first, I would like to clarify that groups are supported, right? So you don't necessarily have to assign roles to specific identities. You can assign roles to Azure AD groups and then manage the membership of that group independently from an Azure AD perspective. Now, role assignment is done through our control plane. So right now we have support of the usual tooling that you use in order to interact with our control plane, PowerShell, CLI, ARM templates. This is fully documented in our public documentation. One little gap that we are still tracking is actually portal support to give you an end-to-end user interface to do that kind of role management from the portal. This is also going to land in the coming month. Awesome. And can I use this with existing managed identities? Yes, absolutely. And I think that's the most beautiful use case. If you are using managed identities, if you have assigned managed identities to, let's say, a virtual machine or an Azure App Service instance, and you want to use that identity to connect to Cosmos DB, that's completely supported. So you can assign roles to those managed identities, and then in your client application, when you initialize your Cosmos DB SDK, you just tell the SDK, well, use the managed identity of the underlying platform, the platform I'm running on, and you don't have to pass any credentials, right? That's the magic and really the beauty of managed identities. Yes, fully supported as well. Oh, cool. And is RBAC available for existing Cosmos DB accounts? It is. It is enabled for all the accounts. All you have to do is to start creating roles, assign roles to identities, and you'll be good to go. Perfect. So I really love security. And I heard there's also another security feature here that we're releasing at Ignite. Can you tell me a little bit about it? Oh yeah, I would be more than happy to do that. And you might think, okay, we went through an amazing lineup of great announcements. That must be it, right? There is no way the Cosmos DB team can deliver even more than that. Well, you should never underestimate us because today I am particularly excited to announce the preview of Always Encrypted on Cosmos DB. This is another huge milestone for us because with this release, Cosmos DB is the very first non-relational database to enter the Always Encrypted family. Now, if you have used Always Encrypted on SQL DB or SQL Server before, you are probably familiar with the concepts that we are introducing here. This is essentially a client-side encryption, right? So this is encryption of your data that's happening client-side in your application through our drivers and SDKs. So that feature lets you define what's called an encryption policy. So that's a policy that you define at the container level. And this policy is going to dictate how you want your different JSON properties to be encrypted. On top of that, this encryption is controlled by customer managed keys. So those are encryption keys that you, the Cosmos DB user, manage independently and store in Azure Key Vault. So this is the right security feature to use whenever you need to deal with some specific sensitive data within your data set. The typical example I give is, let's say, an HR application that obviously is going to handle very sensitive data about employees. And there are specific properties, I would say columns, in relational terms that maybe you don't want anyone to have access to. Maybe there is salary data, maybe there are, social security numbers that, you want to protect. And that's what client-side encryption enables you to do. It essentially lets you lock those specific properties behind those encryption keys that you manage from Azure Key Vault. So essentially, it is per property access control. That feature has entered public preview today. And as with any feature that we run at Cosmos DB, we are more than eager to hear your feedback. And so if you go to the public documentation of Always Encrypted, you will see that we have created a specific email address that you can use in order to reach out to the engineering team that is behind this feature. So please feel free to get started today, try it out, test it out, and by all means, channel all your feedback to us. Awesome. Thank you, Thomas. I see there's quite a bit of questions coming into the IM window. So let's open this up to questions. If you have questions on the features that were the recent announcements, please do ask those. But we can also open up the questions to anything Cosmos DB related. So first one is, Tim, is there a way to build procedures, store procedures in Azure Cosmos DB using .NET? In the past, we've loved to use JavaScript for this, and we have a question here on wondering whether .NET will be supported.
Yeah, so in terms of .NET support for stored procedures, right now you can write stored procedures in JavaScript, and that's the language that's supported for authoring stored procedures. Of course, you can have stored procedures in whatever SDK version that you want, whether it be .NET, Java, or whatever, but the actual stored procedure has to be authored using the Node.js SDK. Now, there is support for transactions. If that's why you're using stored procedures, you can get transaction support in the .NET SDK using the SDK directly. So if that's the kind of the functionality you needed, you could get that in the .NET SDK.
Awesome. Hey, Stephanie, does the Linux emulator work with the Cosmos DB change feed processor?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I'll actually reply to this question with an example of a written blog about this, so you can check it out.
Oh, awesome. And just real quick for our audience, Stephanie, also, how does the emulator compare to the existing Docker-based emulator?
Yeah, so for the Docker-based emulator, the Docker for Windows emulator, customers who are using either Mac OS or Linux OS, they will have to have additional environments or set up a different environments so that they can actually use the emulator. So this is actually just a Linux-based emulator. The emulators both are the same, just specifically for Linux or Mac OS environments.
Awesome. Hey, Deborah, I have a question for you from David. And this, I think, alludes to migration scripts. So often when we make updates to an application, we might need to run a query to update, let's say, for example, a data set that contains a set of users. And within that users, maybe I need to go and update them for, let's say, email address changes. Today, we do this through C# code on retrieving documents, making the edits, and pushing them back. Is there anything coming along where we can write queries to do this easily and more quickly?
Yeah, great question. We have a couple of features coming out in the SDK that are currently in private preview, so we can share the links after. I'll paste them in the chat. A couple of features to help make operations like these easier. So one example is we have a upcoming patch feature, which is, I think, also one of our top user voice items, where instead of having to necessarily read every document that you want to write, if you simply know its ID in the partition key, you can just make the edit and then it'll get pushed to Cosmos DB. We also have another upcoming feature that will allow you to delete all data by a particular logical partition. So for example, if you have partitioned by, let's say, tenant ID and one tenant ID needs to delete all their data, instead of querying for every single, 100,000 documents in the tenant, you can issue one request and delete everything there. So those are some of the things that are coming. I'll paste the links in the chat to private preview signups for those.
Oh, awesome. Hey, Thomas, I have a question for you on managing costs. When we use serverless, is there ability to cap the RU costs so that we don't get surprised?
So cap the RU cost directly? No, because if we gave you a way to say, I don't want to spend more than, let's say, 1 million RUs over the month, this could have a nasty side effect on the actual availability of the database, right? If we were to just, cut everything once you reach that million RUs, we don't think that this would, serve the intent. Instead, there are different things that you can do. First, you can actually monitor your RU consumption with Azure Monitor and set up alerts to make sure that, once you reach, let's say, 80–90% of what would be your RU budget for the month, then you can either send yourself an email or even trigger an action to do something, right? To trigger an Azure function to maybe change something in your provisioning. And by the way, this is completely documented in our public documentation. On top of that, another thing that I would advise you to look at is the budget capabilities of Azure Cost Management. Right? With Azure Cost Management, you can define specific budgets. So those are dollar budgets, not RU budgets, but really defining how much you are willing to spend per month on specific Azure resources. So you can totally go there, create a new budget for your new Cosmos DB serverless account, and then once that budget is reached, or once a specific threshold is reached, again you have this ability to either send yourself an email or trigger an action.
Awesome, thank you, Thomas. I'm going to do a quick time check here. I realize that we are at the scheduled end of the session. So if you do have another session you need to go to, no hard feelings if you need to go to that. But with that said, we're also going to stick around here for another 10 minutes or so to continue answering questions. So if you have a bunch of more Cosmos DB questions, we're also going to stay on that line and continue answering. So let me go to the list again. Tim, we have a question here. One of the challenges we've run into historically is how do we keep our records in sync? So, for example, we might have some relational data that we're bringing into Cosmos DB, we might be also syncing data across Cosmos DB using the change feed. Do you have any advice for how to accomplish this for large-scale applications? And are there any best practices on how to do this?
Yeah, so if you need to keep data in sync between two locations, whether it's maybe two different collections in Cosmos DB, two different containers, maybe two different partitions, or maybe even Cosmos DB in another database entirely, the change feed from the Cosmos DB side is a really great way to subscribe to changes, process the change, and then go replicate it to whatever destination it may be. There's something really cool called the change feed remaining work estimator that actually tells you how far behind you are in processing the change feed. So if you were replicating data from one place to another, you could use the change feed remaining work estimator to monitor, right? If you ever fell, significantly behind in replicating the changes.
Awesome. Hey, Thomas, we have a question here on serverless. Is it possible to switch from serverless to provisioned?
Today, that is not provided turnkey. So today, unfortunately, if you had the desire to switch back and forth between those two models, what you would have to do today is to actually migrate your data. So if you are running on a serverless account and you would like to switch either the entire account or some collections of that account in provision throughput mode, then you would need to create a second account in provision throughput and just migrate the data to reach your goal. This is actually an item that is pretty high on the feedback that we got throughout the preview. And what I can share with our attendees today is that we are actively working on a solution that will actually be a turnkey migration. And our goal is to provide a way for our customers and users to just flip a switch and say, okay, that collection or that account that used to be serverless, I want now I want to run it in provision throughput, and also the other way around.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Another one for you, Thomas. Are there any books, online tutorials, or other resources for learning how to design a data model on Cosmos DB?
Yeah, that's a wide question. I would start answering that question saying that any relevant and general NoSQL material about how to do NoSQL data modeling probably applies to Cosmos DB being a document database that is non-relational, and there are obviously plenty of resources online. If you want to go a bit deeper and a bit more specific on Cosmos DB, we do have some resources on our public documentation. There is one example that actually I wrote a while back, but I think it's still very relevant on how to iterate on a data model and at every step of the way, measuring your performance, measuring how much RUs you are consuming from your requests, and optimize that in a very iterative manner. So I would advise looking at that, and I can paste some link here in the chat. Another good resource, obviously a good resource because that's one of the talks I gave also, I think more than a year ago, is it was a talk about how to approach Cosmos DB when you are a relational developer, right? A relational database user. What are those best practices or habits that you need to break and what's the kind of change of mindset that you need to embrace in order to be successful on Cosmos DB. So this is actually a session that was delivered, I think, at Ignite 2019. But again, this is still extremely relevant because nothing fundamentally has changed from that perspective. Again, I will see if I can paste some links here in the chat for our attendees.
Awesome. That would be much appreciated,
Yep.
Thomas. Hey, Stephanie, we have a question here on the deprecation of Azure Storage Explorer. We have someone who says here, it sounds like the deprecation of Cosmos DB functionality in the Azure Storage Explorer was much missed. Are there any plans for another desktop app or maybe to support Cosmos DB in the Azure Data Studio?
Oh, that is a great question, and that is great that you ask. We are actually in the works. We're collaborating with Azure Data Studio to create a Cosmos DB extension and supporting all APIs. I think we're going to go with MongoDB as an initial scope, and we would love to get feedback on that if you have any more additional interests on what you'd like to see on a desktop tool, but that is definitely on the works.
Awesome. Can't wait to see that. Let's see. Next question is, Tim, are there any plans for Cosmos DB and Event Grid capabilities?
No, there's no plans for that on the, I guess, in the short or medium term, I guess that we have now. I guess it'd be a good follow-up question of, I guess, what functionality whoever asked that question be looking for that the change feed doesn't provide now. But at this time, there's no plans in that area.
Awesome. Victor, would it be okay if Tim, maybe you can reply with your contact info and Victor, follow up with Tim on understanding what the use cases are in this space? We'd love to learn more and take a look at this.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Tim, here's another one for you. Are there any performance problems with using link to SQL library with the older document client as opposed to writing true SQL statements with the newer Cosmos client?
This is a really great question. So the way link queries work in our SDK is we basically take your link query and we just translate it to a SQL query. So if you wrote out that identical SQL query and ran that, it'll have identical and same latency, same RU charge to the link query. So my recommendation would be just write in whatever you prefer, whether it be link or SQL. If you're using an older SDK or a new one, either way, it should be okay. One thing to keep in mind is some of the older SDKs might not have the link functionality implemented that's in newer versions. So that might be one thing to keep in mind, but in terms of performance, no considerations there.
Got it. Thomas, here's a question on managing costs. It sounds like Hakeem, each time he's worked with Cosmos DB, he's found some surprises with the cost of it. Are there any plans to make the costs of Cosmos DB a bit more transparent and also help manage this?
Absolutely, yeah. This is another feedback item that we have heard from our customer over the past couple of years, and we have actually active work streams to address that. Different ways that we are going to facilitate and make cost management more transparent for our customers and users. One is that we are going to leverage more and more Azure advisors because we found that this is a very good channel for us to provide cost recommendations and advisory to anyone using Cosmos DB. So we already have some Azure advisor recommendations going out to our customers. Recently, we've introduced one to promote autoscale as being a way to optimize your costs and save on costs. Another couple of them that are being pushed to free tier customers, for example, to help them also understand really what is the free tier and beyond which threshold they are going to get billed. So we are going to invest more and more on Azure advisors. And besides that, we have some projects going on with Azure Cost Management to bring better clarity around Cosmos DB costs directly embedded in the Cosmos DB resource blade on the portal. So You may have seen that for some of you, new links have started to appear on the Cosmos DB resource blade. There is a new show cost link that some of you may have started to see. This is one sign of that collaboration that we are working on with Azure Cost Management. It's only the beginning. Our goal eventually is to have a much deeper integration of costs within our resource blade to make it even easier for you to understand how much you are spending on Cosmos DB and what actions you can undertake in order to optimize those spendings.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more. This one is for Tim from David. Pagination has been a challenge for us while we deliver APIs via Azure Functions for retrieving data from Cosmos DB using the continuation token. We've also tried offset limit and found the performance in RU to be a bit on the high end. Are there any suggestions, best practices, or improvements coming into this area?
That's a great question. So our recommendation is, wherever possible, you want to use continuation tokens. Continuation tokens help the query engine prevent or needing to do like additional repeated work, right? Where let's say you process the first page of results, think of the continuation token as a bookmark, so it can pick up what left off without needing to go and repeat all the work it did to basically return the first page of results. So for pagination, our recommendation is to use continuation tokens. Now, there's another option that exists, offset limit, where you can offset by a certain number of records and basically limit your results to a certain number of records, a certain number of documents. Now, offset limit right now doesn't really, if you're offsetting by a certain amount, that won't necessarily decrease the RU charge of that query. So offset limit right now will save on some client resources if you compare it to going and actually returning all the pages of results. But it won't save on the server side RU resources. Now, in the upcoming year, we're actually planning some investments to optimize offset limit. These aren't available just yet, but in the future, if you do happen to be using offset limit queries, you might notice some improvements here. But nonetheless, even when those are available, our recommendation is, wherever possible, use continuation tokens.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. And being respectful for all of our other speakers here at Build, I would absolutely encourage you to check out the other sessions. We'll continue to engage and answer questions both via the chat room over here, as well as taking this conversation actually over on Twitter, if you don't mind. You can follow us at Azure Cosmos DB for all the latest news and updates, and we'll also be engaging with you in there. So also please feel free to send in your questions and we'll be more than happy to answer. Lastly, we also have some awesome learning resources. You can continue your learning with Microsoft. We have an awesome link here at aka.ms/learn@build. Thank you so much, Deborah, Thomas, Tim, and Stephanie. You guys have been a wonderful panel to work with.